What does it mean to be the last great Viking? What kind of man could fight across 3 continents and still hunger for more? The Norse people gave the world warriors, explorers, and kings whose names echo through the centuries. They sailed wooden ships across impossible oceans. They built kingdoms with sword and shield. Among all these fierce men, one name stands above the rest. Harald Sigurdsson, called Hardrada, meaning hard ruler, lived a life so extraordinary that it reads like legend. Let us begin by understanding the world into which Harald was born. The land of Norway stretches along the western edge of Scandinavia. It is a country of deep fjords and towering mountains. The coastline twists and turns for thousands of miles. Rocky cliffs plunge down into cold, dark waters. In the valleys between these mountains, small communities made their homes. The soil was often poor. The growing season was short. Life demanded strength and cleverness from everyone who lived there. The people who inhabited this harsh land developed a unique culture. They became skilled sailors out of necessity. The sea provided food when the land could not. Fish, seals, and whales fed families through long winters. The forests gave timber for building homes and ships. Iron ore in the mountains allowed blacksmiths to forge tools and weapons. Every resource mattered. Nothing was wasted. The Vikings, as we call them today, were not a single nation. They were many different groups of people who shared similar languages and customs. The word Viking itself probably comes from an Old Norse term, meaning to go on an expedition. Not everyone who lived in Scandinavia was a Viking. Many were farmers, fishermen, and craftspeople who never left their homelands. But those who did venture out on raids and trading voyages earned a fearsome reputation across Europe and beyond. Their ships were marvels of engineering. Long and narrow, they could sail across open oceans and also navigate shallow rivers. A single ship might carry 60 warriors, plus supplies for weeks at sea. The curved prow often bore carved dragon heads, meant to frighten enemies and ward off evil spirits. These vessels could travel faster than anything else afloat. They gave the Vikings an advantage no other people possessed. Religion shaped every aspect of Viking life. The Norse believed in many gods and goddesses. Odin, the Allfather, ruled over wisdom, war, and death. He had sacrificed one eye to gain knowledge of all things. Warriors hoped to die bravely in battle so that Odin's maidens, the Valkyries, would carry them to Valhalla. This great hall was where the honoured dead feasted and fought until the end of the world. Thor was perhaps the most beloved god among common people. He controlled thunder and lightning. His mighty hammer, Mjolnir, protected both gods and humans from giants and monsters. Farmers prayed to Thor for good weather and successful harvests. His image appeared on amulets worn for protection. Many people named their children after this powerful deity. Freya was the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. She also had connections to war and death. Half of all warriors who fell in battle went to her hall rather than Odin's. Her brother Frey brought peace and prosperity. Together, these gods and many others formed a complex belief system that explained the workings of the universe. The Vikings believed that fate controlled all things. The Norns, 3 powerful beings, wove the destiny of every person at birth. Even the gods could not escape what the Norns had determined. This belief gave warriors courage in battle. If your time had come, nothing could save you. If the Norns had decided you would live, no enemy could kill you. Fighting without fear was both practical and spiritual. Society in Viking Scandinavia was divided into clear groups. At the top were the Jarls, powerful nobles who controlled large estates and commanded many followers. Below them were the carls, free farmers and craftsmen who owned their own land and could bear arms. At the bottom were the thralls, slaves captured in raids or born into bondage. A thrall had no rights, and could be bought, sold, or killed by their owner. Kings existed, but their power was limited. A Scandinavian king ruled only with the consent of his jarls and the free men who followed him. The Thing, a regular assembly of free men, made laws and settled disputes. Even a king had to respect these gatherings. A ruler who became too tyrannical might find himself abandoned or overthrown. Power came from loyalty, and loyalty had to be earned. Gift-giving was central to Viking politics. A generous lord attracted followers. Gold rings, fine weapons, and other treasures flowed from rulers to their warriors. In return, these men pledged their swords and their lives. The relationship was personal and binding. A warrior who abandoned his lord in battle faced eternal shame. A lord who failed to reward his men would soon have no men at all. Women in Viking society had more rights than in many other medieval cultures. They could own property, divorce their husbands, and run businesses. While men went raiding or trading, women managed farms and households. Some women even fought as warriors, though this was rare. The sagas tell of shield maidens who stood in battle lines alongside men. How common this actually was remains debated by historians. Children learned their roles early. Boys practiced with wooden swords and small bows. They learned to sail, fish, and hunt. Girls learned to weave, cook, and manage households. Both genders heard the old stories around winter fires. These tales of gods and heroes taught values and history. Memory was treasured in a culture where few people could read or write. The runic alphabet served for short inscriptions rather than long texts. Runes were carved into stone, wood, bone, and metal. They marked property, commemorated the dead, and invoked magical protection. Each rune had a name and associated meanings beyond its sound. Skilled rune masters could supposedly use these symbols to cast spells and see the future. Trade connected the Viking world to distant lands. Merchants travelled east to Constantinople and Baghdad. They went west to Ireland, England, and beyond. They traded furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves for silver, silk, spices, and wine. Trading posts grew into towns. Towns grew into cities. Birka in Sweden, Hedeby in Denmark, and Kaupang in Norway became wealthy centres of commerce. The Viking Age is usually dated from 793 to 1066. It began with the raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in northern England. It ended with the events we will discuss at length in this story. During these nearly 3 centuries, Scandinavian influence spread across an enormous area. Vikings settled in Iceland, Greenland, and briefly in North America. They conquered parts of England, Ireland, Scotland, and France. They founded the state that became Russia. They served as elite guards for Byzantine emperors. Christianity slowly spread through Scandinavia during this period. Missionaries came from England, Germany, and other Christian lands. Some Vikings converted for practical reasons. Christian merchants sometimes refused to trade with pagans. Accepting baptism opened doors to profitable relationships. Other Vikings genuinely embraced the new faith. Still others held on to the old gods, while publicly accepting Christ. By the time Harald Hardrada was born, around 1015, Norway was in the midst of this religious transformation. His half-brother Olaf was trying to force Christianity on the entire country. This created conflict with powerful chieftains who preferred the old ways. The struggle between old and new, between local independence and royal authority, would shape Harald's early life and set him on his extraordinary path. The Norway of Harald's birth was not a unified kingdom in the modern sense. Different regions had their own traditions and leaders. The western coast looked out toward the Atlantic and the lands beyond. The eastern valleys connected to Sweden and the Baltic. The north was home to the Sami people, who had their own distinct culture. Bringing all these areas under one ruler was a challenge that had defeated many ambitious men. Harald's family had been working toward this goal for generations. His father, Sigurd Syr, was a minor king in the Ringerike district of eastern Norway. More importantly, his mother Asta had previously been married to another king. Her first husband was Harald Grenske, who died before their son Olaf was born. This Olaf would become Saint Olaf, one of the most important figures in Norwegian history. Young Harald thus grew up in the shadow of a remarkable half-brother. The household where Harald spent his childhood was prosperous but not grand. His father Sigurd was known for being a careful farmer rather than a great warrior. The sagas describe him inspecting his fields and managing his estate with close attention. This was unusual for a man of his rank. Most nobles preferred hunting and fighting to agricultural work, but Sigurd understood that wealth came from the land as much as from raiding. Young Harald showed different inclinations from his father. Even as a child he dreamed of battles and conquests. The sagas tell us that when Olaf visited their home, he asked his 3 half-brothers what they most wanted. The older boys gave practical answers about farms and cattle. Harald, still very young, said he wanted warriors. When Olaf asked how many, Harald replied that he wanted enough to eat up all of Sigurd's cattle in a single meal. This answer pleased Olaf greatly. He saw in his youngest half-brother a kindred spirit. The bond between Harald and Olaf would prove fateful. Olaf had spent years abroad as a Viking raider before returning to claim the Norwegian throne. He had fought in England, France and Spain. He had been baptized in Normandy and returned to Norway, determined to make it a Christian kingdom. His methods were often brutal. Those who refused to convert he sought faced execution or mutilation. This earned him many enemies among the traditional chieftains. Harald grew up hearing stories of his brother's adventures and watching his struggle to control Norway. The political situation was complicated. Denmark's king, Knut the Great, had built a massive empire that included England. He wanted Norway as well. Many Norwegian nobles preferred distant Danish overlordship to Olaf's harsh rule. They invited Knut to take control. Olaf found himself facing rebellion from within and invasion from without. In 1028, when Harald was about 13 years old, Olaf was forced to flee Norway. Knut's forces and rebellious Norwegian nobles were too powerful to resist. Olaf went first to Sweden and then to the court of his brother-in-law, Grand Prince Yaroslav of Kiev. Harald was too young to accompany him on this exile. He remained in Norway, watching and waiting as events unfolded. The next 2 years were a time of Danish rule in Norway. Knut placed Norwegian nobles in charge but kept ultimate authority for himself. Many who had welcomed Danish intervention began to regret their choice. The Danes demanded heavy taxes. Local chieftains found themselves with less power than before. Memories of Olaf began to soften. Perhaps his rule had not been so bad after all. Olaf decided to return and reclaim his kingdom. In 1030 he gathered what forces he could and marched back into Norway. Harald, now about 15 years old, joined his half-brother's army. This would be his first taste of real battle. It would also be one of the most significant events of his life. Everything that followed stemmed from what happened in the summer of 1030. The summer of 1030 brought Olaf Haraldsson back to Norwegian soil. He had gathered warriors from Sweden and other lands. His army was not large, perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 men, but Olaf believed that God was on his side. He had dreamed that he would become a great saint. Whether he lived or died, he felt certain of ultimate victory. Harald rode with his brother toward destiny. The young man had never experienced real combat. Training with wooden weapons was one thing. Facing men who wanted to kill you was something else entirely. But Harald showed no fear. The sagas describe him as eager for battle, burning with desire to prove himself. His older brother's cause became his own. The opposing army was much larger. Norwegian nobles who had rejected Olaf gathered their forces. They had perhaps 14,000 warriors, outnumbering Olaf's men by more than 3 to 1. These were not Danes or other foreigners. They were Norwegians fighting against their own king. The coming battle would be a civil war, countrymen slaughtering countrymen over questions of power and religion. The two armies met at a place called Stiklestad on July 29th, 1030. The site was in the Trondheim region of central Norway. Rolling farmland surrounded the battlefield. A small river flowed nearby. The summer sun shone brightly, though an eclipse would darken the sky during the fighting. Medieval people saw such events as signs from heaven. What this particular sign meant depended on which side you asked. Olaf arranged his men in a traditional Norse formation. The strongest warriors stood at the front with overlapping shields. This shield wall was the basic defensive tactic of the age. Behind the front line, other warriors waited to fill gaps or press forward when the enemy weakened. Olaf himself took position in the centre where the fighting would be fiercest. A king was expected to lead from the front, not command from safety. Harald was placed with a group of warriors, though the exact details vary in different sources. He was young and inexperienced, but he was the king's brother. This gave him status beyond his years. The men around him would have watched to see how the youth handled himself. Would he prove worthy of his bloodline, or would he shame his family with cowardice? The battle began in late morning. The rebel army advanced toward Olaf's position. Arrows flew, spears arced through the air. Then the two shield walls crashed together with a tremendous noise. Men pushed against each other, stabbing with swords and axes over the tops of their shields. The din was overwhelming. Screams of wounded men mixed with battle cries and the clash of metal on metal. Olaf fought with desperate courage. He knew he was outnumbered. He knew that many of his opponents were skilled warriors with personal grudges against him. But he believed in his cause and his god. The sagas give him several heroic moments during the battle. He supposedly killed many enemies with his sword and his axe. His personal guard fell around him one by one. Harald also fought bravely. For a 15-year-old, in his first battle, he showed remarkable composure. The chaos of combat can overwhelm even experienced soldiers. The noise, the blood, the constant threat of death from any direction, these things break many men. But Harald kept fighting. He stood his ground when others fled. He struck at enemies who came within reach. The battle lasted for hours. Slowly, inevitably, numbers began to tell. Olaf's smaller army could not sustain its losses. Gaps appeared in the shield wall. Enemies poured through these openings. The organised formation broke down into scattered groups, fighting for survival. This was the most dangerous phase of any medieval battle. Once formation was lost, defeat usually followed quickly. Olaf received multiple wounds as the fighting continued. A spear thrust injured his leg. An axe blow cut into his neck. Finally, a sword stroke to his stomach brought him down. The King of Norway fell among his loyal followers. Those who remained alive tried to protect his body from further harm, but the battle was lost. Olaf's army had been destroyed. Harald was wounded during the fighting. The sources disagree about how seriously. Some say he was merely cut and bruised. Others describe more significant injuries. What is certain is that he survived when many around him did not. As the rebel army celebrated its victory, Harald and other survivors slipped away from the battlefield. The young man found himself a fugitive in his own country. His brother was dead. The cause they had fought for seemed lost. Harald was wounded, hunted, and far from any safe haven. This was his lowest moment, the point where his story might have ended as a minor footnote in Norwegian history. Instead, it became the beginning of an incredible journey. Harald made his way east, away from the centres of power in Norway. He travelled through forests and over mountains, avoiding settlements where enemies might find him. Local farmers, some of whom had secretly supported Olaf, helped the wounded prince. They gave him food and shelter, tended his injuries, and pointed him towards safety. The journey took weeks. Harald crossed into Sweden, where he was beyond the reach of Norwegian enemies. From there, he continued east toward the lands of the Rus. His destination was Kiev, where his half-brother had found refuge before. The ruler there, Yaroslav the Wise, was married to a Swedish princess and had connections throughout Scandinavia. He had sheltered Olaf once. Perhaps he would shelter Olaf's young brother now. The distance from Stiklestad to Kiev is roughly 1,500 miles. Harald travelled this enormous span with only a few companions. He was still recovering from his battle wounds. The route passed through dense forests, across wide rivers, and over open plains. Bandits and wild animals posed constant threats. Simply surviving the journey was an achievement. Meanwhile, back in Norway, strange things began to happen around Olaf's body. The king had been buried quickly after the battle, but within months people reported miracles at his grave. The blind could see. The sick were healed. Olaf's body, when exhumed, showed no signs of decay. His hair and nails had continued to grow. These were classic signs of sainthood in medieval belief. The very nobles who had killed Olaf began to regret their actions. Danish rule proved even more oppressive than they had feared. Knut's representatives demanded heavy taxes and showed little respect for Norwegian traditions. The dead king started to look better in memory than he had in life. Within a year of Stiklestad, Olaf was being venerated as a saint. Churches were built in his honour. His cult spread throughout Scandinavia and beyond. This transformation of Olaf from hated tyrant to beloved saint would have enormous consequences for Harald. He was now the brother of a saint, a member of a holy bloodline. This gave him legitimacy that mere military success could never provide. When he eventually returned to Norway, he would come not just as a warrior, but as the heir of Saint Olaf. The disaster at Stiklestad, which seemed like the end of everything, actually planted the seeds of Harald's future greatness. But all of that lay far in the future. In the autumn of 1030, Harald was simply a wounded teenager trying to reach safety. He arrived in Kiev sometime that fall or winter. Yaroslav received him with honour. The Grand Prince recognised Harald's potential value. This young man was connected to the Norwegian royal family. He might prove useful in future political schemes. Kiev, in the 11th century, was one of the great cities of Europe. The Rus state, founded by earlier Scandinavian adventurers, had grown into a powerful kingdom. Trade routes connected Kiev to Constantinople, Baghdad, and the Baltic. Churches and palaces rose along the Dnapr River. Merchants from many lands crowded the markets. For a young man from rural Norway, it must have seemed like entering another world. Harald spent several years in Yaroslav's service. He learned the ways of a more sophisticated court than anything Norway could offer. He saw how a great prince managed his realm, balancing military force with diplomacy and economic power. He also continued his education as a warrior. The Rus faced constant threats from steppe nomads and rival princes. There were plenty of opportunities for a young man to prove himself in battle. The sources for this period of Harald's life are limited. We know he served Yaroslav loyally and gained the prince's trust. We know he participated in military campaigns, though the details are unclear. We know that he grew from a wounded boy into a formidable young warrior. But the specifics of his daily life in Kiev remain shadowy. What we do know is that Harald was ambitious. He wanted more than a comfortable position at a foreign court. He wanted glory, wealth, and eventually a kingdom of his own. Kiev was a good place to recover and learn, but it was not his final destination. The young Norwegian began to look further south, toward the greatest city in the Christian world. Constantinople called to him, and Harald answered. The Byzantine Empire in the 11th century was the most powerful Christian state in the world. Its capital, Constantinople, had stood for 700 years as the greatest city in Europe. Massive walls protected a population of perhaps 500,000 people. Churches, palaces, and public buildings of stunning beauty lined its streets. The wealth concentrated there exceeded anything in Western Europe. Harald had heard stories of Constantinople since childhood. Scandinavians had been travelling to the Byzantine capital for generations. They went as traders, selling furs and slaves for gold and silk. They went as mercenaries, offering their swords to the emperor. Some even went as pilgrims, seeking the holy relics that Constantinople possessed in abundance. The city drew ambitious men from across the known world. The journey from Kiev to Constantinople followed well-established routes. Traders had been making this trip for centuries. The Dnieper River provided the first leg, flowing south toward the Black Sea. Dangerous rapids interrupted the river at several points. Travellers had to portage their boats around these obstacles, carrying everything overland while watching for nomad raiders. Many never completed the journey. Harald set out from Kiev around 1034 or 1035. He was now about 20 years old, fully grown and hardened by his experiences. He travelled with a group of companions, fellow Scandinavians seeking fortune in the south. They may have joined a trading expedition for safety in numbers. The steppe was no place for small groups of travellers. The Black Sea crossing brought them to Byzantine territory. From the northern coast, they would have travelled overland or by coastal shipping to reach Constantinople. Each mile brought them closer to the centre of civilization. The contrast with their homeland must have been striking. Paved roads, stone buildings, cultivated fields stretching to the horizon, these were things rarely seen in Scandinavia. Constantinople itself exceeded all expectations. The city sat on a peninsula where Europe met Asia. The Golden Horn, a natural harbour, provided safe anchorage for hundreds of ships. The Bosphorus Strait connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, making Constantinople the crossroads of international trade. Everything valuable in the known world passed through this city at some point. The walls of Constantinople were legendary. Built over centuries, they had never been breached by an enemy army. 3 lines of fortification protected the landward side. Towers rose at regular intervals, providing platforms for archers and artillery. The sea walls were equally formidable. Any attacker faced the prospect of enormous casualties with little chance of success. Inside the walls, the city amazed visitors with its grandeur. The Hagia Sophia, built 4 centuries earlier, remained the largest church in Christendom. Its massive dome seemed to float above the interior, supported by hidden engineering that mystified observers. Gold mosaics covered the walls and ceilings, glittering in candlelight. Services there involved hundreds of clergy, clouds of incense, and music of unearthly beauty. The imperial palace complex covered a vast area near the city's eastern tip. Multiple buildings housed the emperor, his family, his court, and the endless bureaucracy that ran the empire. Gardens and courtyards provided space for ceremonies and relaxation. The throne room was designed to overwhelm visitors with the majesty of imperial power. Mechanical devices made golden lions roar and metal birds sing. The emperor's throne could be raised toward the ceiling, making him seem to ascend toward heaven. Harald came to Constantinople seeking employment in the Varangian Guard. This elite unit served as the emperor's personal bodyguard. Its members were primarily Scandinavians, though men from other northern lands also served. The name Varangian probably comes from an Old Norse word meaning sworn companions. These warriors had sworn oaths of loyalty to the Byzantine emperor, and they took those oaths seriously. The Varangian Guard had existed for about 50 years when Harald arrived. It was founded around 988, when the Byzantine emperor requested military aid from the Rus prince Vladimir. Vladimir sent 6,000 warriors, and these men became the core of the new guard unit. Over time, the guard developed a reputation for fierce loyalty and exceptional fighting ability. Why did Byzantine emperors trust foreign mercenaries more than their own subjects? The answer lay in the treacherous politics of Constantinople. Byzantine history was filled with coups, assassinations, and civil wars. Emperors were overthrown by their own generals, murdered by their own relatives, blinded and imprisoned by rivals. Native troops often had divided loyalties. They might support a rebel who promised them rewards. The Varangians had no stake in Byzantine politics. They did not care which faction of nobles held power. They did not scheme to place their own candidates on the throne. They simply served whoever paid them and wore the imperial purple. This made them invaluable to emperors who could trust no one else. The Varangians guarded the emperor's person, protected the palace, and fought in the most dangerous battles. Joining the Varangian Guard was not automatic. Candidates had to prove their worth. They needed to demonstrate skill with weapons, physical strength, and courage. They also needed to bring their own equipment. A Varangian was expected to provide his own armour, weapons, and other gear. This meant that only men with some resources could apply. Harald's years of service in Kiev had presumably allowed him to acquire the necessary equipment. The guard accepted Harald into its ranks. His royal blood may have helped, though the Byzantines cared more about ability than ancestry. What mattered was that Harald could fight. He had already proven himself at Stiklestad and in the campaigns of the Rus. Now he would prove himself again in the service of the most powerful ruler in Christendom. The Byzantine emperor, when Harald arrived, was probably Michael IV. This emperor came from humble origins, a money changer's son who had caught the eye of the Empress Zoe. He married her after the death of her previous husband, possibly with some help in hastening that death. Michael suffered from epilepsy and other health problems, but he proved to be a capable ruler despite his ailments. Harald entered a world of unimaginable sophistication. The Byzantine court operated according to elaborate protocols developed over centuries. Every gesture, every word, every piece of clothing carried meaning. Hierarchy was everything. Knowing your place and acting accordingly could mean the difference between advancement and disaster. For a Norwegian prince accustomed to more straightforward social rules, this must have required significant adjustment. The Varangians had their own barracks and their own traditions within this complex system. They lived together, trained together, and fought together. Their primary weapon was the great two-handed axe, though they also used swords and other arms. The sight of these tall, fierce northerners with their massive axes terrified Byzantine enemies. Even the sound of their war cries, shouted in incomprehensible Norse, added to their psychological impact. Harald rose quickly through the ranks of the guard. His royal blood, his previous military experience, and his natural abilities all contributed to his advancement. Within a few years, he held a leadership position. Some sources suggest he eventually commanded the entire Varangian Guard, though this is debated. What is certain is that he became one of the most prominent Scandinavians in Byzantine service. The emperor used his Varangians for various purposes. They guarded the palace and the imperial person. They accompanied the emperor on ceremonial occasions, adding to his majesty with their impressive appearance. They also fought in the empire's wars, which during Harald's time were numerous and far-flung. The Byzantine Empire faced threats on multiple frontiers, and Harald would see action on many of them. Harald's service in the Varangian Guard took him across the Byzantine Empire and beyond. He fought in campaigns that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Middle East to the steppes of Asia. This was military experience on a scale that no Norwegian king had ever possessed. Harald was becoming one of the most travelled and battle-tested warriors of his age. The first major campaign came in Sicily. The island had been under Muslim rule for over a century. Arab emirs controlled the fertile lands and prosperous cities. The Byzantine Empire wanted Sicily back. It had been Roman territory for over 1,000 years before the Arab conquest. Reclaiming it would restore imperial prestige and provide valuable resources. The Byzantine general George Maniakes led the Sicilian expedition. He was one of the most capable commanders of the era, a giant of a man with a fearsome reputation. Under his leadership, Byzantine forces landed in Sicily in 1038. Harald and his Varangians were part of this army. They would play a crucial role in the campaigns that followed. The fighting in Sicily was fierce. Arab defenders knew the terrain and fought with determination. Byzantine forces had to capture fortified cities one by one. Siege warfare was slow and costly. Disease killed as many soldiers as enemy weapons. The summer heat exhausted men accustomed to cooler climates. Yet the Byzantines pressed forward, winning victory after victory. Harald distinguished himself in these battles. The sagas describe him performing heroic deeds. Though the details may be exaggerated, what seems clear is that he earned a reputation for courage and tactical skill. He was not just a brave fighter, but a clever one. He found ways to achieve objectives that others thought impossible. One famous story involves the capture of a fortified city. The defenders had sealed the gates and manned the walls. Direct assault would cost many lives. Harald supposedly ordered his men to capture birds that nested in the city's buildings. They attached burning materials to the birds and released them. The birds flew back to their nests, starting fires throughout the city. In the confusion, Harald's forces attacked and captured the place. Whether this story is true remains uncertain. Similar tales appear in other medieval sources, suggesting it may be a common legend attached to various heroes. But even if the specific incident is fictional, it reflects Harald's reputation for cunning. He was known as a commander who could find unconventional solutions to difficult problems. The Sicilian campaign ultimately failed despite its early successes. Byzantine politics intervened. General Maniakes quarrelled with other commanders and with officials at court. He was recalled to Constantinople and eventually rebelled against the emperor. Without his leadership, the Sicilian expedition fell apart. Arab forces recaptured most of what had been lost. Harald and the surviving Varangians returned to Constantinople. The next major theatre of operations was Bulgaria. The Byzantine Empire had conquered Bulgaria in the early 11th century after decades of brutal warfare. But the Bulgarians had not accepted their subjugation quietly. Rebellions broke out repeatedly. Harald participated in campaigns to suppress these uprisings, fighting in the rugged mountains and valleys of the Balkans. Bulgarian warfare was different from what Harald had experienced in Sicily. The terrain favoured defenders who knew the mountains. Ambushes were constant threats. Supply lines stretched through hostile territory. The Bulgarians fought with the desperation of people defending their homeland. These were not wars of conquest, but wars of pacification, grinding struggles to maintain control over resentful populations. Harald learned valuable lessons in Bulgaria. He saw how difficult it was to hold territory against a hostile population. He experienced the challenges of mountain warfare, where conventional tactics often failed. He also witnessed Byzantine methods of dealing with rebellion, which could be extremely harsh. Entire villages were sometimes destroyed to punish resistance. Such brutality might achieve short-term results, but often created long-term problems. The Middle East also called Harald to war. The Byzantine Empire shared a long border with various Muslim states. Conflict along this frontier was almost constant. Raids and counter-raids, sieges and battles, diplomatic manoeuvres and broken truces, the pattern repeated endlessly. Harald fought in several campaigns in this region, adding to his experience of warfare in different environments. One significant expedition took Byzantine forces into the territory around Jerusalem. The Holy City was under Muslim control, as it had been for centuries. Christian pilgrims could usually visit, but relations between the faiths fluctuated. When Harald travelled to Jerusalem, probably in the early 1040s, he was following a path that many Scandinavians had walked before him. The journey to Jerusalem was both military and spiritual. Harald went as a warrior, but also as a pilgrim. He visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over the site where Christ was supposedly buried and resurrected. He bathed in the Jordan River, where Jesus had been baptized. He saw the places where biblical events had occurred. For a Christian of the 11th century, this was a profound experience. Harald reportedly contributed to the restoration of holy sites in Jerusalem. He gave gold to repair churches and to support Christian communities in the Holy Land. This generosity enhanced his reputation as a pious warrior. He was not just fighting for pay, but for faith. The combination of military prowess and religious devotion was highly valued in medieval culture. The sagas claim that Harald fought in 83 battles during his time in Byzantine service. This number may be exaggerated, but it reflects the intensity of his military career. He spent roughly a decade in the empire's wars, fighting almost constantly. By the time he left Constantinople, he had more combat experience than almost anyone alive. Harald also accumulated enormous wealth during these years. Byzantine soldiers received regular pay, but the real money came from plunder. Successful campaigns yielded gold, silver, jewels, and other valuables. Officers like Harald received larger shares than common soldiers. He also engaged in various business ventures, using his position to profit from trade and other activities. The Varangian Guard had a special privilege called palace plundering. When an emperor died, the Varangians were allowed to enter the imperial treasury and take whatever they could carry. This was their traditional right, compensation for their loyal service. Harald reportedly participated in this privilege at least once, possibly more. The wealth he acquired was staggering by Scandinavian standards. But Harald's time in Constantinople was not without difficulties. He made enemies as well as friends. His success bred jealousy. His ambition threatened others who sought advancement. The Byzantine court was a dangerous place where rivals plotted constantly against each other. Harald navigated these treacherous waters for years, but eventually his luck ran out. The circumstances of Harald's departure from Byzantine service are murky. Different sources give different accounts. Some say he was accused of misappropriating imperial funds. Others claim he was involved in a scandal with a noblewoman. Still others suggest he simply decided it was time to leave. What seems clear is that his departure was not entirely voluntary. One dramatic story has Harald imprisoned by the Empress Zoe. According to this tale, he had rejected her romantic advances and she sought revenge. Harald supposedly escaped from prison with the help of a miraculous intervention. A woman, perhaps the Virgin Mary herself according to some versions, appeared and guided him to freedom. He then blinded the Emperor Michael before fleeing the city. This story is almost certainly legendary. The details do not match what we know of Byzantine politics at the time. Empress Zoe was quite old when Harald served in Constantinople, making a romantic pursuit unlikely. The blinding of an emperor would have been a major event recorded in Byzantine sources, yet none mention Harald's involvement. The tale probably grew from later Scandinavian storytelling, embellishing Harald's adventures with dramatic flourishes. What actually happened was probably more mundane. Harald likely fell out of favour with powerful people at court. Perhaps he had accumulated too much wealth and influence. Perhaps he had offended someone important. Perhaps he simply recognised that his opportunities in Constantinople were exhausted. Whatever the reason, he decided to leave and return north. Leaving Byzantine service was not simple. The empire did not like losing valuable soldiers. Harald had to find a way out that would not result in his arrest or execution. He managed this though the exact method remains unclear. Some sources suggest he left secretly, slipping away before anyone could stop him. Others indicate he received official permission to depart. The truth may lie somewhere between these accounts. Harald took his accumulated wealth with him. Gold, silver, precious gems, fine fabrics, and other treasures filled his baggage. He also took loyal followers, men who had served with him in the Varangian guard and chose to continue following him. This small army of experienced warriors would prove invaluable in the years ahead. The route back north passed through familiar territory. Harald returned to Kiev, where he had spent time before joining Byzantine service. Grand Prince Yaroslav still ruled there, and he welcomed Harald warmly. The young man who had arrived wounded and desperate a decade earlier now returned as a wealthy and famous warrior. His transformation was remarkable. Kiev in the early 1040s remained a prosperous and powerful city. Yaroslav the Wise had expanded his realm and enhanced its prestige. He had built churches and monasteries, promoted learning and literacy, and established connections with royal families across Europe. His daughters married kings of France, Hungary, and Norway. His court attracted scholars, artists, and ambitious men from many lands. Harald found a changed situation when he returned. His half-brother, Olaf, was now venerated as a saint throughout Scandinavia. The cult of St. Olaf had grown enormously in the years since Stiklestad. Churches dedicated to the martyred king stood in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and beyond. Pilgrims travelled to his shrine in Trondheim, seeking miracles. Olaf's reputation had been completely transformed from harsh tyrant to holy protector. This transformation benefited Harald directly. He was no longer just a refugee prince from a failed cause. He was the brother of one of Scandinavia's most beloved saints. This connection gave him legitimacy that money could not buy. When Harald eventually claimed the Norwegian throne, he would do so as St. Olaf's heir, continuing a sacred bloodline. But Norway was not yet within Harald's reach. Another man sat on the throne. Magnus, the son of St. Olaf, had become King of Norway in 1035. He had been only about 11 years old at the time, a child placed on the throne by nobles who wanted a figurehead they could control. But Magnus had grown into a capable ruler. He had also inherited the Danish throne when the last heir of Knut's line died in 1042. Magnus now ruled both Norway and Denmark. Harald needed to decide his next move carefully. He could not simply march into Norway and demand the crown. Magnus had supporters, resources, and the advantage of possession. A direct challenge would likely fail. Harald needed allies, needed to build his position, needed to wait for the right opportunity. Patience was required, though patience did not come naturally to a man of Harald's temperament. While in Kiev, Harald pursued another goal. He sought the hand of Yaroslav's daughter Elizabeth in marriage. This was an ambitious match for a landless prince, even one with Harald's wealth and reputation. Yaroslav's daughters married kings, not exiles hoping to become kings. But Harald was persuasive, and his prospects were improving. Elizabeth, called Elisif in Norse sources, was apparently a remarkable woman. She was educated, cultured, and strong-willed. The marriage negotiations took some time, but eventually Yaroslav agreed. Harald and Elizabeth were wed, probably in 1044 or 1045. This union connected Harald to one of the most powerful families in Eastern Europe. It also gave him a partner who would share his adventures for the rest of his life. The wedding celebrations were lavish. Harald's Byzantine wealth allowed him to display generosity on a grand scale. He gave gifts to Yaroslav, to Elizabeth, to the nobles of the Kievan court. He demonstrated that he was not merely a wandering adventurer, but a man of substance who could afford to be generous. This display served political purposes as well as social ones. With his marriage secured, Harald turned his attention westward. News from Scandinavia suggested that opportunities might be opening. Magnus was facing challenges in Denmark. The Danes resented Norwegian rule and supported various claimants to their throne. Magnus had to spend much of his time and resources dealing with Danish resistance. This distracted him from Norway itself. Harald gathered his followers and his treasure. He said farewell to Yaroslav and Elizabeth, though she would join him later. He sailed west across the Baltic Sea towards Sweden. From there he would assess the situation and plan his next moves. The wanderer was finally heading home, though home had changed greatly during his long absence. Sweden provided a temporary base. Harald had connections there through his family and through the broader network of Scandinavian nobility. He could gather information, recruit additional followers, and prepare for whatever came next. The Swedish king was not hostile to Harald's ambitions, seeing potential benefit in having a friendly ruler in Norway. The news from Norway was encouraging. Many Norwegians were unhappy with Magnus's rule. The king spent too much time in Denmark, they complained. He neglected Norwegian interests in favour of his southern kingdom. Taxes were heavy. Justice was uneven. The old noble families felt disrespected. These grievances created an opening for a challenger. Harald began making contact with discontented Norwegian nobles. He sent messengers, made promises, and distributed gifts. His Byzantine gold bought loyalty that might otherwise have been unavailable. Men who had served Magnus began to reconsider their allegiances. A prince with Harald's wealth and military reputation was an attractive alternative to the current king. Magnus learned of Harald's activities and recognised the threat. He could not ignore a challenger with such resources and such a famous name. But Magnus also could not simply attack Harald without cause. That would make Magnus look like a tyrant, undermining his own legitimacy. The two men needed to find a way to resolve their competing claims. Negotiations began, probably in 1046. The details of these discussions are not entirely clear, but the outcome is known. Magnus and Harald agreed to share the Norwegian throne. They would rule together as co-kings, dividing the responsibilities and revenues of the kingdom. This was an unusual arrangement, but it avoided civil war. Neither man had to fight the other, at least for now. The agreement also addressed Harald's wealth. He had brought enormous treasure from Constantinople, far more than Magnus possessed. The deal required Harald to share this wealth with Magnus, evening out their resources. In exchange, Harald received recognition as a legitimate king with equal status to Magnus. Both men compromised to achieve peace. Harald arrived in Norway as a king in 1046. He was about 31 years old. 16 years had passed since he fled as a wounded teenager after Stiklestad. In that time he had travelled farther and fought more battles than any Norwegian before him. He had served emperors and married a princess. He had accumulated wealth beyond imagination. Now he had finally achieved what he had always wanted. He was a king. The co-rule of Magnus and Harald lasted only about a year. The two kings apparently got along reasonably well, despite the awkwardness of their situation. They were cousins of a sort, both connected to Saint Olaf. They shared some common interests and faced common enemies. But the arrangement was inherently unstable. Two kings in one kingdom created confusion and potential conflict. Fate intervened before any conflict could develop. In October 1047, Magnus fell ill while campaigning in Denmark. The sickness was severe, and Magnus knew he was dying. On his deathbed, he made a crucial decision. He named Harald as his sole heir to Norway. The Danish throne he left to Svein Estridsson, a Danish noble who had been fighting against Magnus for years. Magnus died on October 25, 1047. He was only about 23 years old. His reign had been brief but significant. He had united Norway and Denmark, defeated numerous enemies, and maintained relative peace in his realms. His death at such a young age cut short what might have been a remarkable career. Instead, he became a footnote to Harald's story. Harald was now sole King of Norway. He had achieved his ultimate goal through a combination of luck, skill, and patience. The wounded boy who fled Stiklestad had become the undisputed ruler of his homeland. But Harald was not satisfied. Magnus had also been King of Denmark. Why should Harald not claim that throne as well? Harald's reign as King of Norway would last nearly 20 years. During this time, he transformed the country in significant ways. He strengthened royal authority, expanded trade, built churches and towns, and imposed his will on nobles who had grown accustomed to independence. His methods were often harsh, earning him the nickname Hardrada, meaning hard ruler. But his accomplishments were undeniable. The Norway that Harald ruled was still a young kingdom. Unified royal authority dated back only about a century. Before that, the country had been divided among many local chieftains who acknowledged no superior. The kings who had tried to unite Norway faced constant resistance from nobles who preferred the old ways. Harald's own half-brother Olaf had died fighting this resistance. Harald approached the challenge of ruling with the same determination he had shown in war. He believed that a strong king was essential for Norway's prosperity and security. Local nobles who defied royal authority were not just political opponents, but threats to the entire kingdom. They had to be brought to heel, by persuasion if possible, by force if necessary. The king travelled constantly throughout his realm. He held courts in different regions, hearing cases and dispensing justice. He collected taxes and tribute, ensuring that royal revenues flowed properly. He inspected defences and assessed the loyalty of local leaders. His presence reminded everyone that Norway had a king who was watching. Harald's justice could be severe. The sagas describe him punishing enemies with execution, mutilation, and confiscation of property. Men who opposed him lost their lands, their freedom, or their lives. This harshness created fear, which Harald saw as useful. A king who was feared would be obeyed. A king who was seen as weak would face endless challenges. But Harald was not merely cruel. He could also be generous to those who served him loyally. He rewarded faithful followers with gifts, lands, and positions of honour. He protected those under his authority from outside threats. He maintained order so that farmers could work their fields and merchants could conduct their business. The harsh ruler was also an effective administrator. Religion played an important role in Harald's reign. Christianity had been established in Norway for only about a generation. Many people still remembered the old gods and the old ways. Some practiced the old religion secretly, while publicly accepting Christ. Harald worked to strengthen Christianity throughout his kingdom, building churches and supporting clergy. The connection to St. Olaf was central to Harald's religious policy. He promoted his half-brother's cult energetically. He supported the shrine at Nidaros, which became a major pilgrimage destination. He encouraged the writing of stories about Olaf's miracles and martyrdom. By enhancing Olaf's sanctity, Harald enhanced his own legitimacy as Olaf's heir and avenger. Harald also brought Byzantine influences to Norwegian Christianity. He had spent years in Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world. He had seen churches of incredible beauty and ceremonies of elaborate splendour. He wanted to bring some of that sophistication to his own kingdom. Churches built during his reign showed Byzantine artistic influences. The king founded or expanded several towns during his reign. Oslo, which would eventually become Norway's capital, grew significantly under Harald's patronage. He recognized the importance of trade for royal revenues and national prosperity. Towns provided markets where goods could be exchanged and taxed. They also provided bases for royal administration, places where the king's representatives could maintain permanent presence. Trade connections expanded during Harald's reign. Norwegian merchants travelled to England, Denmark, the Baltic lands, and beyond. They exported fish, timber, furs, and other products of the northern lands. They imported grain, wine, fine cloth, and luxury goods. Harald encouraged this commerce, understanding that wealthy merchants meant wealthy kings. The king maintained a substantial military force. His personal guard, the Hird, consisted of professional warriors who served him year-round. Beyond this corps, he could call upon the Ledang, a system of military obligation that required free men to serve when summoned. Ships were particularly important. Norway's geography made naval power essential for both defence and offence. Harald's fleet was formidable. He built large warships capable of carrying many warriors. His flagship was reportedly the largest ship ever built in Norway up to that time. These vessels allowed him to project power along the coast and across the seas. No enemy could feel safe from a king who could appear anywhere with overwhelming force. The administration of the kingdom required many helpers. Harald appointed men to serve as his representatives in different regions. These officials collected taxes, administered justice, and maintained order in the king's name. They reported to Harald and depended on his favour for their positions. This created a network of royal agents throughout the country. Not everyone appreciated Harald's strong rule. Some nobles resented the loss of their traditional independence. They remembered when their ancestors had been virtually sovereign in their own territories. Now they had to answer to a king who demanded obedience and punished defiance. Grumbling was constant, though open rebellion was rare. The most serious domestic challenge came from a man named Einar Tambarskjaldfr. Einar was one of the most powerful nobles in Norway, a man whose family had dominated the Trondheim region for generations. He had supported Magnus and was not enthusiastic about Harald's rule. The two men clashed repeatedly over questions of power and precedence. The conflict between Harald and Einar escalated over several years. Einar gathered supporters who shared his resentment of royal authority. Harald watched these activities with growing concern. He could not allow a powerful noble to build an independent power base that might threaten the throne. Something had to be done. The crisis came to a head in 1050. Harald summoned Einar to a meeting, supposedly to discuss their differences. When Einar arrived with his son, Harald's men attacked and killed them both. The murders were brutal and shocking. Einar had come under a promise of safe conduct, which Harald violated. This treachery horrified many Norwegians. The aftermath of Einar's death was tense. His supporters were furious but also frightened. If Harald would kill such a prominent man, no one was safe. Some nobles fled the country, others submitted to the king and hoped for mercy. Harald consolidated his control over the Trondheim region, eliminating the last major centre of noble independence. Harald justified his actions as necessary for the kingdom's stability. Einar had been plotting rebellion, he claimed. Killing him prevented civil war and saved many lives. Whether this justification was accurate or merely convenient is impossible to know. What is clear is that Harald's power was now unchallenged within Norway. No noble dared oppose him openly. The king's family life during these years was complex. His wife Elizabeth had joined him in Norway after his return from the east. She bore him 2 daughters, Maria and Ingegerd. But Harald also had a relationship with a Norwegian woman named Thora, who bore him 2 sons, Magnus and Olaf. These sons would eventually succeed their father as kings of Norway. The status of Thora in Harald's household is unclear. Some sources call her a concubine, others a second wife. Polygamy was not unknown in Scandinavia, though Christianity officially prohibited it. Harald may have maintained both relationships simultaneously, or he may have set Elizabeth aside at some point. The sources are contradictory and incomplete. What is certain is that Harald's sons were considered legitimate heirs. Magnus, the elder, was groomed to succeed his father. Olaf was also raised as a prince with expectations of power. The two boys grew up in their father's court, learning the skills they would need to rule. Harald ensured that his dynasty would continue after his death. Harald's ambitions extended beyond Norway. He believed he had a legitimate claim to the Danish throne. Magnus had been king of Denmark, as well as Norway. When Magnus died, he had separated the two crowns, leaving Denmark to Svein Estridsson. Harald rejected this division. He argued that Magnus had no right to give away what belonged to the Norwegian crown. Svein Estridsson was a formidable opponent. He came from the old Danish royal family, descended from the legendary King Svein Forkbeard and related to Knut the Great. He had spent years fighting against Magnus for the Danish throne. When Magnus died, Svein finally achieved his goal. He was not about to surrender it to Harald. The war between Harald and Svein lasted for about 15 years, from 1048 to 1064. It was a grinding conflict of raids, counter-raids, and occasional larger battles. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory. The geography of Scandinavia made conquest difficult. Both countries had long coastlines that were vulnerable to naval attack, but hard to defend. Harald's strategy focused on destruction rather than occupation. He led annual raids into Danish territory, burning farms, killing livestock, and carrying off plunder. His goal was to weaken Svein's kingdom economically and undermine his support among the Danish nobles. If Denmark became too impoverished and unstable, perhaps Svein's own people would turn against him. The raids were devastating for the Danish countryside. Villages were destroyed, crops were burned, and people were killed or enslaved. The suffering of ordinary Danes was immense, but this suffering did not translate into political change. Svein remained on his throne, and his nobles remained loyal. The Danish people blamed Harald for their misery, not their own king. Harald also attempted to capture Danish towns. These fortified places were centres of wealth and power. Controlling them would give Harald permanent footholds in Denmark. But siege warfare was slow and expensive. Towns that resisted could hold out for months. Harald's forces were better suited for quick raids than prolonged sieges. The most significant battle of the Danish wars occurred at Nassau in 1062. Harald gathered a large fleet and sailed into Danish waters seeking a decisive confrontation. Svein accepted the challenge, bringing his own fleet to meet the Norwegians. The two forces clashed in a naval battle that lasted through an August night. The Battle of Nassau was fierce and bloody. Ships grappled together, and warriors fought hand to hand across the decks. Harald's personal skill and the quality of his warriors gave the Norwegians an advantage. By morning, the Danish fleet was shattered. Svein himself barely escaped, swimming to shore and fleeing on horseback. Harald had won a great victory, but it proved hollow. He could not follow up by conquering Denmark. His forces were exhausted, and he lacked the resources for a prolonged occupation. Svein soon recovered and continued resisting. The war dragged on for 2 more years without significant change. Finally, in 1064, Harald and Svein agreed to make peace. Both men were tired of fighting. The war had achieved nothing except destruction and death. Harald gave up his claim to Denmark. Svein was recognised as the legitimate Danish king. The two countries would remain separate, each with its own ruler. The peace with Denmark was a defeat for Harald, though he tried to present it otherwise. He had spent 15 years and enormous resources trying to conquer Denmark, and had failed. His raids had caused tremendous suffering, but had not brought victory. The great warrior had met his match in the stubborn resistance of Svein and the Danish people. Why did Harald fail in Denmark when he had succeeded elsewhere? Several factors contributed. Denmark was larger and more populous than Norway. It had more resources to sustain a long war. The Danes were fighting to defend their homeland, which gave them motivation that Harald's raiders lacked. And Svein proved to be a resilient leader who would not give up no matter how many defeats he suffered. Harald also faced logistical challenges. Norway could not support a permanent occupation force in Denmark. The distances were too great, and the supply lines too vulnerable. Harald could win battles but could not hold territory. Each year he would raid, and each year the Danes would recover after he left. This pattern could continue indefinitely without producing a decision. The failure in Denmark may have influenced Harald's later decisions. He had learned that some targets were too difficult to conquer, but he had also learned that he was still a formidable warrior who could win battles against any opponent. When a new opportunity arose, Harald would be ready to seize it. The year 1066 would become one of the most famous dates in history. 3 kings would fight for the English throne, and the outcome would reshape the future of Europe. Harald Hardrada would play a central role in these events, though not the role he hoped for. England, in the mid-11th century, was a wealthy and well-organised kingdom. It had been united for over a century under a succession of capable kings. The English economy was prosperous, based on agriculture, trade, and wool production. English towns were numerous and thriving. The country was a prize worth fighting for. The English throne had complicated connections to Scandinavia. Danish kings had ruled England for much of the early 11th century. Knut the Great had been King of England, Denmark, and Norway simultaneously. His empire had fallen apart after his death, but the connections remained. Norwegian and Danish rulers continued to believe they had legitimate claims to England. Harald's claim to England was based on an agreement supposedly made between Magnus and Harthacnut, the last Danish king of England. According to this agreement, whichever of them died first would leave his kingdoms to the other. Harthacnut died in 1042, and Magnus claimed to have inherited his right to England. Magnus never actually invaded England, but the claim passed to Harald when Magnus died. The validity of this claim was questionable. Even if the agreement existed, it was not clear that it could transfer to Harald. Magnus had specifically separated Norway and Denmark in his will, suggesting he did not consider all his claims to be automatically inherited together. English people certainly did not recognise any Norwegian right to their throne. England had its own succession crisis in 1066. King Edward the Confessor died in January without a clear heir. He had no children, and several men claimed the right to succeed him. The most powerful of these was Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, and the most influential noble in England. Harold was not of royal blood, but he had Edward's deathbed blessing and the support of the English nobility. Harold Godwinson was crowned king on the day after Edward's death. He moved quickly to secure his position, knowing that challenges would come. His most dangerous rival was William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier. William was already preparing an invasion force to enforce his claim. Harald Hardrada saw an opportunity in England's crisis. The English throne was contested, and the new king was not yet secure. If Harold could strike quickly, he might be able to seize the kingdom before Harold Godwinson consolidated his power. The wealth of England would make all his previous conquests seem trivial. Harold had an ally in England. Tostig Godwinson, brother of King Harold, had been exiled from England after a rebellion against his rule as Earl of Northumbria. Tostig was bitter and eager for revenge against his brother. He travelled to Norway in early 1066 and urged Harold to invade. Tostig promised that many English nobles would support Harold once he arrived. The Norwegian king listened carefully to Tostig's arguments. England was wealthy and relatively close. The new English king was untested and faced threats from multiple directions. With Tostig's local knowledge and connections, an invasion might succeed where the Danish wars had failed. Harold decided to take the gamble. Preparations for the invasion began in the spring of 1066. Harold summoned his warriors and gathered his fleet. Ships came from all over Norway, carrying men eager for plunder and glory. The size of the invasion force is uncertain, but it probably included about 300 ships and perhaps 10,000 warriors. This was one of the largest Viking expeditions ever assembled. Harold's son Olaf accompanied the expedition, gaining experience for his future role as king. But Harold's elder son Magnus remained in Norway to govern in his father's absence. This division ensured that the kingdom would have a ruler regardless of what happened in England. Harold was confident but not foolish. Elizabeth and her daughters also came with the fleet, at least for part of the journey. They stopped in Orkney, the island chain north of Scotland that was under Norwegian rule. There they would wait for news of the invasion. If Harold succeeded, they would join him in his new kingdom. If he failed, they would return to Norway. The fleet sailed from Norway in late summer 1066. The crossing was uneventful, and the ships reached Orkney safely. There Harold gathered additional forces from the Norse settlements in Scotland and the islands. Tostig also joined with whatever followers he had managed to recruit. The combined force was formidable. From Orkney, the invasion fleet sailed south along the Scottish coast and then down the eastern shore of England. They entered the Humber estuary, the great inlet that led into the heart of northern England. This was the traditional route for Scandinavian invaders. Danish armies had used it many times in the past. The Norwegians landed and began ravaging the countryside. They burned villages, seized supplies, and announced their presence with fire and sword. Local English forces tried to resist, but were swept aside. The invaders advanced inland toward York, the largest city in northern England and the key to controlling the region. York had been a Viking city centuries earlier. The Danes had ruled there for generations, and Scandinavian influence remained strong. Many people in northern England had Norse ancestry and spoke languages related to Norwegian. Harold may have hoped that these cultural connections would make the northerners more willing to accept his rule. The Earls of northern England gathered their forces to resist the invasion. Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria were brothers-in-law of King Harold Godwinson. They commanded the military resources of the north and were determined to stop Harold before he could advance further. The two earls marched their army to meet the Norwegians. The armies met at Fulford, just south of York, on September 20th, 1066. The English had perhaps 5,000 warriors, a substantial force but smaller than Harold's army. They took up a defensive position along a marshy stream, hoping the terrain would neutralize the Norwegian numerical advantage. The battle began in the morning. Harold arranged his forces carefully, placing his best warriors where they would have the greatest impact. The Norwegians advanced across the difficult ground, struggling through mud and water to reach the English line. The fighting was fierce, with neither side giving way easily. Harold's experience showed in the battle. He identified the weak point in the English line and concentrated his attack there. The Norwegian warriors, many of them veterans of years of fighting, pressed forward relentlessly. The English began to give ground, slowly at first, then more rapidly, as their formation started to break. The collapse, when it came, was sudden and complete. The English line shattered, and men fled in all directions. Many were cut down as they ran, others drowned in the marshes trying to escape. The Earls Edwin and Morcar survived, but their army was destroyed. Northern England lay open to the invaders. 2. The victory at Fulford was complete. Harold had defeated the only English army in the north and cleared his path to York. The city surrendered without a fight, its leaders recognising that resistance was hopeless. Harold entered York as a conqueror, accepting the submission of local nobles and demanding hostages to ensure their loyalty. The Norwegian king seemed to be on the verge of achieving his greatest conquest. He had defeated the English army, captured the most important city in the north, and established himself as the dominant power in the region. If he could consolidate his gains and defeat any further resistance, England might become his. But Harold did not know that King Harold Godwinson was already marching north with the main English army. The English king had been in the south, watching for William of Normandy's expected invasion. When news of the Norwegian landing reached him, Harold acted with astonishing speed. He gathered his forces and headed north, covering nearly 200 miles in just 4 days. Harald Hardrada, meanwhile, was relaxing after his victory. He moved his army to Stamford Bridge, a crossing point on the River Derwent east of York. There he waited to receive the hostages and supplies that York had promised. He expected no further resistance. The northern English army had been destroyed, and any relief force would take weeks to arrive. Or so he believed. The Norwegian warriors were scattered and at ease when English scouts reported a large army approaching. Harold initially thought this must be more northerners coming to submit to him. The dust cloud raised by the advancing force was enormous, suggesting thousands of men. As the army drew closer, Harold realised his mistake. This was not a delegation of submissive nobles. This was an enemy army coming to fight. September 25th, 1066, dawned clear and warm. It was an unusually hot day for late September in England. The Norwegian warriors had left much of their armour on the ships, not expecting battle. Many wore only light protection, or none at all. They were about to face the full strength of the English kingdom. King Harold Godwinson had achieved complete surprise. His rapid march north had caught the Norwegians unprepared. Now he intended to destroy them before they could recover. The English army was large and well equipped, filled with professional warriors who had trained for exactly this kind of battle. Harald Hardrada faced a desperate situation. Part of his army was on the wrong side of the river, cut off from the main force. His men were scattered and poorly equipped. The enemy outnumbered him and held the initiative. A lesser commander might have tried to retreat or negotiate. Harold chose to fight. The battle began at the bridge itself. A small group of Norwegians held the crossing, buying time for their comrades to form a battle line. The sagas tell of one giant warrior who single-handedly held the bridge against the entire English army. He killed dozens of attackers until an Englishman floated under the bridge in a barrel and stabbed him from below. This story may be legendary, but it reflects the desperate nature of the fighting. The Norwegians on the near side of the river were overwhelmed and killed. The English then crossed the bridge and advanced toward Harold's main position. The Norwegian king had used the delay to organise his remaining forces into a defensive formation. Harold arranged his men in a circle or wedge formation, with shields overlapping to create a defensive wall. This was a traditional Norse tactic for fighting against superior numbers. The formation was strong defensively, but limited mobility. Harald was betting everything on his warriors' ability to hold their ground until something changed the situation. The English attacked in waves. They would advance, clash with the Norwegian shield wall, and then fall back to rest and reorganize. The Norwegians held firm, their long axes and swords taking a terrible toll on the attackers, but each attack cost the defenders casualties they could not replace. The circle slowly shrank as men fell. Harald fought in the front ranks, as a Norse king was expected to do. He was over 50 years old now, but still a formidable warrior. The sagas describe him cutting down enemies with tremendous strokes of his sword. His presence inspired his men to fight harder, to hold on despite the impossible odds. The battle raged for hours under the hot September sun. Men fought until they could barely lift their weapons. The ground became slippery with blood. Bodies piled up around the Norwegian position. Still the defenders held, refusing to break despite everything the English threw at them. Then Harald fell. An arrow struck him in the throat, a wound that no armour could have prevented. The greatest Viking warrior of his age died on a field in England, far from the fjords and mountains of his homeland. He was about 51 years old. He had been fighting for nearly 40 of those years. The death of Harald did not immediately end the battle. Tostig took command and continued the resistance. The Norwegians fought on, perhaps hoping that reinforcements from the ships would arrive in time, but no help came. The men guarding the fleet were too far away and knew nothing of the battle. Eventually, Norwegian reinforcements did arrive. The warriors from the ships had heard of the fighting and marched to join their comrades, but they arrived exhausted from their rapid march, and many had put on heavy armour that made the journey even more difficult. They were in no condition to turn the tide of battle. The English attacked the newcomers with fresh energy. The tired Norwegians could not withstand the assault. Their formation broke, and the battle became a rout. Men fled toward the ships, pursued by English warriors eager to complete the victory. Many Norwegians drowned trying to cross rivers, or were cut down as they ran. King Harald Godwinson offered mercy to the survivors. Tostig had been killed in the battle, so there was no one left to lead continued resistance. The Norwegian Prince Olaf, Harald's son, was allowed to gather the survivors and sail home. Of the 300 ships that had brought the invasion force, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was one of the most decisive victories in English history. It destroyed the Norwegian invasion and killed one of the most famous warriors of the age. It also exhausted the English army and left it far from the south, where another invasion was about to begin. Just 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy landed on the southern coast of England. King Harald had to march his tired army all the way back south to meet this new threat. The two forces met at Hastings on October 14, 1066. This time, Harald was defeated and killed. William became King of England, and history took a different course. Harald Hardrada's death at Stamford Bridge is often cited as the end of the Viking Age. This is a symbolic rather than a literal statement. Scandinavian raids and expeditions did not cease immediately in 1066, but Harald was the last Scandinavian king to lead a major invasion of Western Europe. After him, the age of Viking expansion was truly over. Why did the Viking Age end? Many factors contributed. The Scandinavian countries were becoming more settled and organised. Christianity had taken root, bringing new values that discouraged raiding and violence. Trade was becoming more important than plunder as a source of wealth. The targets of Viking raids had also grown stronger, and better able to defend themselves. Harald himself represented both the old Viking ways and the new medieval order. He was a raider and warrior in the traditional mould, but he was also a Christian king who built churches and administered an organised state. He looked back to the heroic age of his ancestors while also participating in the emerging world of medieval kingdoms. The news of Stamford Bridge reached Norway within weeks. Harald's son Magnus, who had remained behind to govern, now became sole king. He ruled for about 2 years before dying, possibly of illness or injury. His brother Olaf then took the throne and ruled for many years, bringing peace and stability to Norway. Olaf Haraldsson, later called Olaf Kyrre, meaning Olaf the Peaceful, represented a dramatic change from his father's reign. Where Harald had been aggressive and warlike, Olaf was cautious and diplomatic. Where Harald had sought conquest abroad, Olaf focused on developing Norway internally. The contrast between father and son could not have been more striking. Olaf had witnessed the disaster at Stamford Bridge firsthand. He had seen his father die and watched the Norwegian army destroyed. This experience shaped his entire approach to kingship. He understood the costs of military adventure in ways that Harald never had. Peace became his guiding principle. The survivors who returned to Norway carried stories of the battle. These accounts spread throughout Scandinavia and beyond. Harald's death became legendary, the subject of poems and sagas that would be told for centuries. The great warrior had met his end, fighting against impossible odds, exactly as a Viking hero should. Elizabeth, Harald's wife, learned of her husband's death in Orkney, where she had been waiting. Her grief must have been profound. She had shared Harald's adventures for over 20 years, travelling from Kiev to Norway and supporting his ambitions. Now she was a widow in a foreign land, far from her childhood home in Rus. Elizabeth eventually returned to Norway with her daughters. Her fate after that is uncertain. Some sources suggest she lived quietly in Norway for the rest of her life. Others indicate she may have returned to Kiev. The historical record simply does not tell us what happened to this remarkable woman who had been queen of one of Europe's most famous kings. Thora, the mother of Harald's sons, also fades from the historical record after his death. She had given Harald his heirs and presumably held an honoured position in his household. Whether she lived to see her sons rule Norway is unknown. The sagas focus on kings and warriors, leaving the women in their lives largely invisible. Harald Hardrada left Norway transformed. The kingdom he ruled for nearly 20 years was very different from the one he had claimed in 1046. Royal authority was stronger. The power of independent nobles was broken. Christianity was more firmly established. Towns and trade had expanded. Norway had become a more unified and organised state. The administrative systems Harald created outlasted him. His network of royal officials continued to function under his successors. The tax collection methods he established provided revenue for future kings. The legal reforms he implemented shaped Norwegian law for generations. Harald built institutions, not just won battles. The church in Norway owed much to Harald's patronage. He had built churches throughout the kingdom, including the great cathedral at Nidaros that housed St. Olaf's shrine. He had supported the clergy and encouraged the spread of Christian learning. His Byzantine experiences had given him a vision of what Christian culture could achieve. The cult of St. Olaf reached its full development during Harald's reign. The shrine at Nidaros became one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in northern Europe. Miracles were reported regularly. The saint's fame spread to England, Denmark, Sweden, and beyond. Harald had successfully transformed his half-brother from a controversial king into a beloved holy figure. Trade flourished under Harald's rule. Norwegian merchants travelled widely, selling fish, timber, and other northern products. They bought grain, wine, cloth, and luxury goods from southern lands. The wealth generated by this commerce enriched the kingdom and provided resources for royal projects. Oslo grew significantly during Harald's reign. The town had existed before, but Harald expanded it and made it an important centre. He may have founded the first church there. He certainly encouraged settlement and trade. Oslo would eventually become Norway's capital, though that lay far in the future. The military reforms Harald introduced also had lasting effects. His emphasis on professional warriors and well-built ships created a model that his successors followed. The Norwegian navy remained a formidable force for centuries. The techniques of shipbuilding and seamanship that Harald promoted continued to develop. Harald's harsh methods of rule were controversial even in his own time. The sagas record criticism of his cruelty and his willingness to break oaths. The killing of Einar Tambarskjolfr particularly damaged his reputation. Yet the same sources acknowledge his effectiveness as a ruler. He maintained order, defended the kingdom, and left Norway stronger than he found it. The nickname Hardrada itself reflects this ambivalence. It can be translated as hard ruler, harsh ruler, or even ruthless ruler. The name acknowledges both Harald's strength and his severity. He was not a gentle king, but he was a successful one. His methods achieved results, even if they left bitterness behind. Later Norwegian kings looked back on Harald with mixed feelings. They admired his military achievements and his expansion of royal power. They used the institutions he created and followed the precedents he established. But they also recognized the dangers of his approach. A king who ruled too harshly might face rebellion. A king who sought conquest abroad might lose everything. Harald Hardrada became one of the great figures of Norse literature. The sagas devoted extensive attention to his life and adventures. Poets composed verses celebrating his deeds. Storytellers passed down tales of his exploits from generation to generation. He became larger than life, a hero whose adventures rivaled those of the ancient gods. The primary source for Harald's life is Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, written in Iceland around 1230. Snorri was a brilliant historian and storyteller who gathered earlier sources and wove them into a coherent narrative. His account of Harald is detailed, vivid, and generally reliable, though he wrote nearly 2 centuries after the events he described. Snorri portrayed Harald as a complex figure. He was brave, clever, and ambitious. He was also cruel, treacherous, and greedy. Snorri did not try to make Harald into a simple hero or villain. He presented a fully human character with both virtues and flaws. This nuanced portrayal makes Snorri's Harald one of the most memorable figures in medieval literature. Other sagas also mention Harald, though usually in less detail. The Morkinskinna and Fagerskinna are earlier works that cover some of the same ground as Heimskringla. They sometimes preserve details that Snorri omitted or present events differently. Comparing these sources helps historians understand what actually happened versus what later storytellers invented. Skaldic poetry provides another window into Harald's life. These complex, highly structured poems were composed by court poets during Harald's own lifetime. They were meant to be memorized and recited, preserving accounts of the king's deeds. Though difficult to interpret, Skaldic verses are valuable because they were created by eyewitnesses rather than later authors. Harald himself was reportedly a skilled poet. Several verses attributed to him survive in the sagas. These poems show a man of culture and learning, not just a brutal warrior. Harald could appreciate beauty and express himself with sophistication. His years in Constantinople had refined tastes that were unusual for a Scandinavian king. One famous poem attributed to Harald was supposedly composed during his final campaign. As he prepared to invade England, he reflected on his life and accomplishments. The verses express both pride in his achievements and awareness of his mortality. Whether Harald actually composed these lines, or whether they were attributed to him later, is impossible to know. The sagas present Harald's life as a series of adventures. His escape from Stiklestad, his journey to Constantinople, his service in the Varangian Guard, his return to claim the Norwegian throne, his wars against Denmark, and his final invasion of England form a narrative arc that could hardly be improved by fiction. Harald lived a life that needed no embellishment. Yet embellishments certainly occurred. The story of Harald blinding the Byzantine emperor is almost certainly fictional. The tale of him capturing cities with burning birds may be borrowed from other sources. The account of his imprisonment by Empress Zoe seems to be legend rather than history. Separating fact from fiction in Harald's story is a constant challenge. The legendary Harald served purposes beyond entertainment. He became a model of Viking heroism, embodying the values that Scandinavians admired. Courage, cunning, generosity, and ambition were all displayed in his story. Young men hearing tales of Harald learned what their culture expected of them. Harald also served as a warning. His story showed the dangers of excessive ambition. He had conquered much but always wanted more. His final invasion of England was a gamble that failed disastrously. The lesson was clear. Even the greatest warriors could overreach and lose everything. Understanding Harald Hardrada requires understanding the world he lived in. The 11th century was a time of tremendous change across Europe and beyond. Old orders were collapsing while new ones emerged. Harald's life intersected with many of these transformations. The Byzantine Empire that Harald served was past its peak but still formidable. The great conquests of Basil II had expanded imperial territory to its greatest extent in centuries. But internal problems were accumulating. Court factions struggled for power. The military was increasingly dependent on foreign mercenaries. Within a generation of Harald's departure, the empire would suffer catastrophic defeat at Manzikert and lose most of Asia Minor. The Kievan Rus, where Harald found refuge, was at its height under Yaroslav the Wise. This vast state stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It was Christian, literate, and connected to both Byzantine and Western European civilization. But the Rus state was also fragile, held together by the personality of its ruler rather than by strong institutions. After Yaroslav's death, it would fragment into competing principalities. Western Europe was experiencing the changes that historians call the High Middle Ages. Population was growing, towns were expanding, trade was increasing, the church was reforming itself and asserting independence from secular rulers. New forms of government and society were emerging that would shape the future of the continent. England, in 1066, stood at a crossroads. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom had been one of the most sophisticated states in Europe. Its government was efficient, its church was learned, and its culture was rich. But the succession crisis that followed Edward the Confessor's death exposed its vulnerability. The Norman conquest would transform England utterly. Scandinavia itself was changing. The Viking Age was ending as the northern lands became more integrated into Christian Europe. Kings were building stronger states with permanent administrations. The church was establishing parishes and collecting tithes. The old ways of raiding and plundering were giving way to more settled patterns of life. Harald Hardrada stood at the intersection of all these changes. He was a Viking warrior who served a Byzantine emperor. He was a pagan king's brother who became a Christian monarch. He was a raider who built towns and churches. He looked backward to the heroic age of his ancestors, while also participating in the emerging medieval world. This transitional quality makes Harald fascinating to historians. He embodied contradictions that defined his era. He was both the last of the old Vikings and one of the first medieval Scandinavian kings. His life marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. Harald Hardrada was not the only remarkable figure of his time. The 11th century produced many extraordinary individuals whose lives intersected with his or paralleled it in interesting ways. Comparing Harald to his contemporaries helps us understand both his uniqueness and his typicality. William the Conqueror, who won England just weeks after Harald lost it, shared some similarities with the Norwegian king. Both were ambitious rulers who sought to expand their domains through conquest. Both were skilled military commanders who won famous victories. Both transformed the kingdoms they ruled, but William succeeded where Harald failed, and that success shaped all subsequent history. The contrast between Harald and William is instructive. Harald was a warrior first and an administrator second. William was both, but his administrative abilities may have been even more impressive than his military ones. The systems William created in England lasted for centuries. Harald's Norwegian achievements, while significant, were less enduring. Svein Estridsson, Harald's longtime rival for Denmark, offers another comparison. Svein lacked Harald's military genius but possessed greater political skill. He survived defeat after defeat, always bouncing back to continue the struggle. His patience and persistence eventually wore Harald down. Svein died in his bed as King of Denmark, while Harald died on a foreign battlefield. The Byzantine emperors Harald served provide yet another point of comparison. These rulers commanded resources and territories far beyond anything Scandinavian kings possessed. Yet they often proved less capable than Harald in military matters. The contrast between Byzantine sophistication and Byzantine weakness impressed Harald and influenced his own approach to kingship. Yaroslav the Wise of Kiev was perhaps the ruler Harald most admired. Yaroslav combined military success with cultural achievement. He built churches and libraries, promoted learning and law, and expanded his realm through both war and diplomacy. Harald's later efforts to develop Norway may have been inspired by what he saw in Kiev. Among Harald's own family, the comparison with Saint Olaf is inevitable. The two half-brothers shared many qualities. Both were fierce warriors. Both were determined to impose their will on Norway. Both died fighting against overwhelming odds. But Olaf became a saint, while Harald became a legend of a different kind. The difference lay partly in how they died, and partly in how their stories were told afterward. Magnus, Harald's nephew and co-ruler, presents an interesting contrast. Magnus was a successful king who united Norway and Denmark and defeated many enemies. But he died young, before he could fully establish his legacy. Harald lived longer and accomplished more. Yet Magnus is often remembered more favourably. The sources treat Magnus as a good king and Harald as a great but flawed one. Harald Hardrada was one of the most experienced military commanders of the medieval period. His career spanned nearly 4 decades of almost constant warfare. He fought on 3 continents, in climates ranging from Mediterranean heat to Scandinavian cold. He commanded forces ranging from small raiding parties to large invasion armies. His military record deserves careful analysis. Harald's greatest strengths were personal courage and tactical flexibility. He led from the front, inspiring his men by example. He adapted his tactics to different situations rather than following rigid formulas. He was willing to use deception and surprise when direct assault seemed too costly. These qualities made him dangerous to any opponent. His experience in Byzantine service gave Harald advantages that few Scandinavian commanders possessed. He had seen how professional armies operated. He had learned siege techniques that were unknown in the north. He had observed the use of combined arms, coordinating infantry, cavalry, and naval forces. This knowledge informed his later campaigns. Harold's weaknesses were less obvious but equally important. He sometimes underestimated his opponents, as at Stamford Bridge. He could be overconfident after victories, relaxing his guard when he should have remained alert. His ambition sometimes led him to attempt conquests that were beyond his resources. The failure in Denmark showed the limits of his power. The Norwegian military system that Harald commanded had both strengths and weaknesses. Norwegian warriors were individually skilled and highly motivated. They fought with ferocity that terrified opponents. The Norwegian fleet was excellent, capable of projecting power across vast distances. But Norway was a poor country with a small population. It could not sustain prolonged wars against larger opponents. Harold's campaigns in Sicily and the Middle East showcased his abilities at their best. He was operating as part of a larger Byzantine force, with resources and logistics provided by the empire. He could focus on tactics and leadership without worrying about supply or reinforcement. Under these conditions, he achieved remarkable successes. The Danish wars revealed Harold's limitations. He was operating independently, with only Norwegian resources to draw upon. He could win battles, but could not translate those victories into lasting conquest. The strategic situation favoured his opponent, who only had to survive while Harald had to achieve decisive victory. Persistence was not enough when the fundamental balance of power was unfavourable. Stamford Bridge was both Harold's greatest tactical achievement and his greatest strategic failure. He won the Battle of Fulford decisively, destroying the northern English army. But he then allowed himself to be surprised by Harold Godwinson's rapid march. The tactical situation at Stamford Bridge was desperate, yet Harold nearly won anyway. His death from an arrow was the kind of random chance that could affect any battle. What if Harold had won at Stamford Bridge? This counterfactual question has intrigued historians for centuries. If Harold had defeated Harold Godwinson, he would have faced William of Normandy next. The outcome of that confrontation is impossible to predict. Harold was the more experienced commander, but William had advantages in numbers and position. The history of England and Europe might have been very different. Harald Hardrada's contributions to culture are often overlooked in favour of his military exploits. Yet he was a significant patron of the arts and a cultured man in his own right. His years in Constantinople exposed him to the highest achievements of Byzantine civilization. He brought some of that sophistication back to Norway. The churches built during Harald's reign showed Byzantine influence in their architecture and decoration. Norwegian craftsmen learned new techniques from foreign masters. Mosaics, frescoes, and metalwork reflected styles that Harald had seen in the East. The visual culture of Norway was enriched by these imports. Harald's court attracted poets and scholars. The king himself composed verses that were admired by contemporaries. He rewarded skalds who praised his deeds with generous gifts. This patronage encouraged the development of Norse literature and helped preserve the traditions that would later be written down in the sagas. Music also flourished under Harald's patronage. He had heard the elaborate liturgical music of Byzantine churches and wanted something similar for Norway. Church music became more sophisticated during his reign. Secular entertainment also benefited from royal support. The legal and administrative reforms Harald introduced had cultural implications. Written records became more important. Literacy spread among the clergy and some lay people. The skills needed to run a medieval kingdom required education that had previously been rare in Scandinavia. Trade connections that expanded under Harald brought cultural as well as economic benefits. Norwegian merchants encountered foreign ideas and brought them home. Luxury goods from distant lands appeared in Norwegian markets. The horizons of ordinary Norwegians expanded as their country became more connected to the wider world. Harald's promotion of St. Olaf's cult had profound cultural effects. The stories of Olaf's miracles became part of Norwegian identity. The pilgrimage to Nidaros brought visitors from across Europe, exposing Norwegians to foreign customs and ideas. The saint's feast day became a major celebration that united the kingdom. The legacy of Harald's cultural patronage outlasted his military achievements. The churches he built stood for centuries. The literary traditions he encouraged produced the great sagas of the following centuries. The connections to European culture that he fostered continued to develop. In some ways, Harald the patron was more influential than Harald the warrior. Harald Hardrada has remained a compelling figure for nearly 1,000 years. Each generation has found something meaningful in his story. He has been interpreted as a hero, a villain, a symbol of Viking glory, and a cautionary tale about ambition. His image has evolved with changing times and values. In medieval Scandinavia, Harald was remembered as one of the great kings. The sagas presented him as a larger-than-life figure whose adventures spanned the known world. He was a model of Viking excellence, brave and cunning and successful. His death at Stamford Bridge was tragic, but glorious, a fitting end for a warrior who had never known defeat until that final battle. The Reformation and subsequent centuries brought less interest in medieval figures, like Harald. The sagas were still read, but they were seen as curiosities rather than living traditions. Harald became a figure of antiquarian interest rather than popular imagination. The 19th century brought renewed attention to the Viking Age. Romantic nationalism made heroes of medieval Scandinavian figures. Harald Hardrada was celebrated as a symbol of Norwegian greatness. His story was retold in novels, poems, and popular histories. He became part of the national identity that Norway was constructing as it moved toward independence. The 20th century brought more critical perspectives. Historians examined the sources more carefully, separating fact from legend. Harald's cruelty and ambition received more attention. He was no longer simply a hero, but a complex and sometimes troubling figure. Academic study replaced romantic celebration. Popular culture has continued to find Harald fascinating. He appears in novels, films, television series, and video games. The image of the last great Viking king appeals to modern audiences who enjoy stories of adventure and ambition. Harald has become part of the broader cultural phenomenon of Viking enthusiasm. The 1,000-year anniversary of Harald's birth in 2015 brought renewed attention to his life. Exhibitions, publications, and events commemorated the famous king. Scholars reassessed his significance. Popular interest surged. Harald proved that he could still capture imaginations after nearly a millennium. Different countries remember Harald differently. In Norway, he is a founding figure of national history, one of the kings who built the nation. In England, he is the last Viking invader, defeated at Stamford Bridge just before the Norman conquest. In Iceland, he is a character in the sagas, part of the literary heritage. In Russia and Ukraine, he is connected to the history of the Rus. Each perspective reveals different aspects of his significance. Understanding Harald Hardrada requires grappling with difficult source problems. The primary accounts of his life were written long after his death, by authors with their own agendas and limitations. Separating historical fact from literary invention is challenging and sometimes impossible. Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, written around 1230, is the most detailed source for Harald's life. Snorri was a brilliant writer and a careful researcher who used earlier sources that are now lost. But he wrote nearly 2 centuries after Harald's death. He could not have known many details that he presents with confidence. Some of his information must be invention or inference rather than fact. Snorri had access to skaldic poetry composed during Harald's lifetime. These verses are valuable because they were created by eyewitnesses. But skaldic poetry is extremely difficult to interpret. The language is archaic and highly compressed. The imagery is elusive and sometimes obscure. Scholars disagree about the meaning of many verses. The Morkinskinna and Fagaskinna are earlier Icelandic works that also cover Harald's reign. They sometimes preserve information that Snorri omitted or present events differently. Comparing these sources with Heimskringla helps identify what was commonly accepted tradition versus what Snorri added or changed. Byzantine sources mention the Varangian Guard but rarely identify individual members. Harald is not named in any surviving Byzantine text, though some passages may refer to him indirectly. This silence is frustrating. We would like to know how the Byzantines viewed this famous northerner, but they left no clear record. Anglo-Saxon sources describe the invasion of 1066 and the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle provides a contemporary English perspective on these events. Later English historians added details, though their reliability is uncertain. The English sources generally agree with the Norse accounts on major points while differing on details. Archaeological evidence provides limited help for understanding Harald's life. No objects can be definitively connected to him personally. The material culture of 11th century Norway is known from excavations, but linking specific finds to specific individuals is rarely possible. Archaeology confirms the general picture provided by written sources without adding much specific information. The problems with sources mean that many questions about Harald cannot be answered definitively. We do not know exactly when he was born or how old he was when he died. We do not know the details of his service in Constantinople. We do not know precisely what happened in many of the battles he fought. The Harald we know is partly historical and partly legendary. Historians have developed methods for dealing with these problems. They compare multiple sources, looking for agreement and disagreement. They consider the biases and limitations of each author. They use archaeological and other evidence to check claims made in texts. They acknowledge uncertainty rather than pretending to know more than the sources allow. The result is a picture of Harald that is probably accurate in its broad outlines, but uncertain in many details. He really did fight at Stiklestad, serve in Constantinople, and die at Stamford Bridge. He really was King of Norway for nearly 20 years. He really did attempt to conquer Denmark and England, but the specific events, conversations and motivations that the sagas describe may be partly or wholly invented. Harald Hardrada's life offers lessons that remain relevant today. His story illustrates timeless themes about ambition, leadership, success and failure. While we should be cautious about drawing simple morals from complex historical events, certain patterns in Harald's career are worth reflecting upon. The importance of resilience appears throughout Harald's story. He suffered a devastating defeat at Stiklestad when he was just 15 years old. He was wounded, hunted, and forced into exile. Many people in his situation would have given up. Harald instead used his exile as an opportunity. He travelled, learned, and accumulated resources. When he finally returned to Norway, he was far more formidable than when he left. Adaptability was another key to Harald's success. He served masters with very different expectations and customs. He fought in environments ranging from Mediterranean islands to Scandinavian fjords. He dealt with Byzantine court politics and Norwegian noble rivalries. Each situation required different approaches. Harald's ability to adjust to changing circumstances served him well throughout his career. The value of experience appears clearly in Harald's military achievements. He became a great commander by fighting in many different campaigns over many years. There were no shortcuts. He learned by doing, accumulating knowledge that could not be gained any other way. His years in Byzantine service were an education that no Norwegian king had ever received. The dangers of overconfidence also appear in Harald's story. His final campaign in England showed what could happen when a commander assumed too much. Harald expected the Northern English army to be the only opposition he faced. He did not anticipate Harold Godwinson's rapid march. This failure of imagination cost him his life and his army. The limits of military power are illustrated by Harold's failure in Denmark. He could win battles but could not achieve his political objectives. 15 years of warfare produced nothing but destruction. Sometimes force alone is not enough to achieve goals. Other tools, including diplomacy, patience, and compromise, may be necessary. The relationship between means and ends appears throughout Harold's reign. He used harsh methods to achieve his goals, killing rivals and breaking oaths when it seemed necessary. These methods achieved short-term results, but created long-term problems. His reputation for cruelty made people fear him, but also made them reluctant to trust him. A leader who relies too heavily on fear may find that fear is not enough. The importance of legitimacy appears in Harold's careful cultivation of his connection to Saint Olaf. Military power alone did not make a medieval king. He also needed a claim that others would recognize as valid. Harald understood this and worked to enhance his legitimacy through religious patronage and family connections. Power without legitimacy is fragile. The role of chance in human affairs appears starkly at Stamford Bridge. Harald had won the Battle of Fulford decisively. He seemed on the verge of conquering England. Then an arrow struck him in the throat, and everything changed. No amount of skill or preparation could have prevented that random event. Even the greatest leaders are subject to fortune. Harald Hardrada's significance extends beyond his personal achievements. His life illuminates broader historical processes that shaped medieval Europe and continue to influence the modern world. Understanding Harald helps us understand the age in which he lived. The end of the Viking Age is embodied in Harald's career. He was the last Scandinavian king to lead a major invasion of Western Europe. After his death at Stamford Bridge, the pattern of Viking raids and conquests that had terrorized Europe for nearly 3 centuries came to an end. The northern lands became part of Christian European civilization rather than threats to it. Why did the Viking Age end? Harald's life suggests some answers. The Scandinavian countries were becoming more organized states with permanent institutions. Christianity was changing values and priorities. The targets of Viking raids had grown stronger and better able to defend themselves. The balance of power had shifted against the raiders. The formation of medieval kingdoms appears in Harald's efforts to strengthen royal authority in Norway. He was building a state in the modern sense, with bureaucracy, taxation, and centralized power. This process was happening across Europe during the 11th century. Harald was participating in a broader transformation of how societies were organized. The connections between different parts of medieval Europe appear throughout Harald's travels. He moved from Norway to Russia, to Constantinople, to Sicily, to the Holy Land, and back to Scandinavia and England. These journeys remind us that the medieval world was more connected than we sometimes assume. People, ideas, and goods moved across vast distances. The relationship between Christianity and political power appears in Harald's reign. He used the church to enhance his authority, promoting St. Olaf's cult and building churches throughout Norway. Religion and politics were intertwined in ways that modern people sometimes find difficult to understand. Harald understood this relationship and exploited it skillfully. The nature of medieval warfare appears in Harald's many campaigns. Battles were relatively rare. Most military activity involved raids, sieges, and manoeuvring. Logistics often determined outcomes more than tactics. The warrior ethos that the sagas celebrate was real, but it existed within practical constraints that limited what military force could achieve. The role of individuals in history appears in Harald's career. His personal qualities, including his courage, ambition, and intelligence, shaped events in ways that cannot be reduced to impersonal forces. History is made by people, and some people matter more than others. Harald was one of those who mattered. At the same time, Harald's story shows the limits of individual agency. He could not overcome the fundamental disadvantages Norway faced against larger opponents. He could not prevent the arrow that killed him. He operated within constraints that even his remarkable abilities could not transcend. Individuals matter, but so do circumstances. Harald Hardrada lived one of the most extraordinary lives of the medieval period. From wounded teenager fleeing a lost battle, to wealthy veteran of Byzantine wars, to King of Norway, to invader of England, his career spanned an astonishing range of experiences. He travelled farther, fought more battles, and accumulated more wealth than almost anyone of his time. Yet Harald ultimately failed in his greatest ambitions. He could not conquer Denmark, despite 15 years of trying. He could not conquer England, despite winning a major battle. He died far from home, his army destroyed, his dreams unfulfilled. The last great Viking was defeated by an English king who would himself be defeated just weeks later. This combination of extraordinary achievement and ultimate failure makes Harald a compelling figure. He was not simply a hero who always won. He was a complex human being who experienced both triumph and disaster. His story has the shape of tragedy, with a great man brought down by his own ambition. Harald's legacy is mixed. He strengthened Norway, but also brutalized it. He promoted Christianity, but also killed in Christ's name. He built churches and towns, but also burned villages and enslaved captives. He was a man of his time, shaped by values and circumstances very different from our own. We should resist the temptation to judge Harald by modern standards. He lived in a violent age when warfare was normal and expected. The methods he used were common among rulers of his era. His contemporaries did not consider him unusually cruel or ambitious. He was playing the game of medieval politics by the rules that everyone accepted. At the same time, we need not celebrate everything Harald did. Historical understanding does not require moral approval. We can appreciate Harald's achievements while acknowledging the suffering he caused. We can find his story fascinating without wishing to live in his world. The 1,000 years since Harald's death have seen enormous changes. The world he knew has vanished. The values he held have been transformed. The places he travelled have been reshaped beyond recognition. Yet his story continues to resonate. Something in the tale of the last great Viking speaks to enduring human concerns. Perhaps it is the theme of ambition, the drive to achieve greatness that pushes people beyond ordinary limits. Perhaps it is the theme of adventure, the appeal of a life filled with travel and excitement. Perhaps it is the theme of mortality, the reminder that even the greatest warriors eventually fall. Whatever the reason, Harald Hardrada remains a figure who captures our imagination. His body was brought back to Norway after Stamford Bridge. He was buried in the Church of St. Mary in Trondheim, near the shrine of his half-brother, St. Olaf. The warrior who had travelled so far finally came to rest in his homeland. The last great Viking lay among his ancestors, his adventures ended, his story just beginning to be told. The sagas would remember him for centuries. Poets would celebrate his deeds. Historians would debate his significance. His name would echo down through the ages, a symbol of an era that was passing even as he lived. Harald Hardrada, the hard ruler, the last Viking, the king who almost conquered England. His story is part of our shared human heritage, and now his story has been told once more. From the fjords of Norway to the walls of Constantinople, from the fields of Sicily to the bridge at Stamford, we have followed Harald's journey. We have seen his triumphs and his failures, his virtues and his flaws. We have tried to understand a man who lived 1,000 years ago in a world very different from our own. History connects us to the past. It reminds us that we are part of a story much larger than our individual lives. The people who came before us faced challenges, made choices, and shaped the world we inherited. Understanding them helps us understand ourselves. Harald Hardrada's story is one small part of that vast human story, but it is a remarkable part, filled with adventure, drama, and meaning. It deserves to be remembered and retold. It deserves to be known. The Viking ships have long since rotted away. The swords have rusted. The gold has been scattered. But the stories remain. They are our inheritance from those who came before. They connect us across the centuries to people whose lives were so different from ours and yet so recognisably human. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Harald Hardrada's extraordinary life. His story reminds us that history is not just names and dates, but human beings struggling, striving, failing, and sometimes achieving greatness. The past is not dead. It lives in the stories we tell and the lessons we learn. The last great Viking has taken his place in history. His saga is complete, but the human story continues, and we are all part of it. If you enjoyed this exploration of Harald Hardrada's life, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing history to life. Share this video with friends who might appreciate learning about this remarkable figure. Leave a comment telling us what historical topic you would like us to explore next. Until next time, may your own adventures be worthy of a saga.